All right, thank you, sir. We've got a great webinar for you today. Pick your battles, best practices for helping students with pronunciation. I think this is such a great topic and really a great title, that idea of picking your battles and kind of how to be judicious with how we are correcting students and helping students with their pronunciation. I know this is a big concern for students and tutors and teachers alike. If you'll go to the next one, Stephen. So as we're going through the webinar, we're going to ask that you, as you're doing already, use the chat to introduce yourself, use the chat to share links and resources with the group. I know Danielle's going to be sharing a lot of resources in the chat that Stephen mentions, and it's also a good place to ask questions of the group. We are going to ask you, those of you who are attended our webinars before, you know this, we're going to ask you that if you have questions for Stephen about the webinar content, that you put those in the Q&A, and you'll see along the black bar on the bottom of your screen, the little Q&A icon. And we ask that you do that because it makes it easier for us to track if your question has been answered or not. That chat just scrolls and scrolls, and it's very easy for us to lose a question while it's doing that. So questions for Stephen, put those in the Q&A. All right, next one, Stephen. This is always a question that we get. So we are recording this webinar. In about a week, you're going to receive a follow-up email from us. It's going to have links to the webinar recording. We'll upload that to YouTube. We're going to include Stephen's slideshow. We'll have a little summary sheet with the kind of highlights or key points that Stephen talks about. We'll include a transcript of the chat and the Q&A, and we'll also include a certificate for those of you who attend. You'll see on the right-hand side of the screen that we'll also send out a separate email with registration links to coaching sessions. Now, this is a new format that we're doing as part of this Teacher Training Plus project. This webinar is part of that, sponsored by Dollar General Foundation. And the model we're doing is kind of having the webinar, and then a couple of weeks afterwards, giving people that attended the webinar or listened to the recording an opportunity to have a follow-up coaching session with Stephen. And you'll see the dates right there. When you get the slideshow, those links will be in there. You can click on those and register for one that fits your schedule. Stephen will also be sending out a follow-up email after you get the email with the webinar recording and stuff like that, with an opportunity for you to sign up as well. And then I think Danielle might also be posting those links in the chat periodically during the webinar. Stephen, if you'll go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about what these small group coaching sessions are. So generally the idea is a lot of times we attend a webinar, they have great, whoever the presenter is has great kind of suggestions or teaching techniques or strategies that we want to go back and implement. But by the time we get a chance to, we go in and we start working with our students, and things may not work exactly like the presenter described, or additional issues may come up, and we really wish we had an opportunity to go back to that presenter and just ask a couple of follow-up questions. That's really what these coaching sessions are for. So about 2 to 4 weeks after the webinar, you can sign up. They're small groups up to about 10 participants, and it just gives you an opportunity to ask a question of Stephen or the other people that are in the group and kind of say, hey, this is what's going on in my classroom. I'm really not sure how to address this. Do you have any suggestions? And Stephen and the other people there will give you a lot of great ideas. In fact, Stephen, maybe you'd like to share kind of an example of some of those conversations from one of your coaching sessions from your first webinar.
Well, I really enjoyed the coaching sessions that we did on the first webinar, which was on scaffolding. And we had a lot of great discussion among the teachers who, some who had just started and were like, I'm brand new to a multi-level classroom. What do I do? And the questions that we were getting, and sometimes I would answer, sometimes the other people in the group would answer, and we had lots of people who were like sharing different ideas and resources, and it's just a lot of fun to get to be able to interact like that. And particularly for some people who are kind of isolated in their part of the country and they don't really have somebody to ask some of these questions. It was just a great discussion. I really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to these. I really enjoyed this topic a lot.
Fantastic, fantastic. So again, just encourage you guys to look for that email and sign up for those. And I think they'll be really valuable. So I think that's all of my introduction. So Stephen, I think I'm going to turn things over to you, let you introduce yourself and take it from here.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Reid. I'm the program manager for Literacy Volunteers, Charlottesville, Albemarle in Charlottesville, Virginia. I work with volunteer tutors who are working to help students improve their language skills. And as part of a community-based literacy organization, it is just so rewarding for us to get to work with our students and to be able to see their progress as they are as they're learning the language. And so I'm going to just jump straight into our topic. Pick your battles, helping practice, best practices for helping students with pronunciation. And sometimes we know that pronunciation can be a big challenge for a lot of our students, because English can get very tricky sometimes. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what you can do to help your student improve their pronunciation skills. We're going to be looking at a few different things today, spending a little time talking about when to correct and when not to correct, then kind of dig into the nuts and bolts about how do you actually make these corrections and what are you looking for in very specific terms. And then some general advice and some tips and tools that can help you as you're working with your student on improving their pronunciation. So what you need to understand first and foremost is this is not something that I am going to give you a magic wand here today and you're going to go back and start working with your student and tomorrow pronunciation is going to be perfect. That's just not how this game is played. It is not unreasonable for you and your student to practice something dozens of times before it really gets locked into place. I think it's very important for you to be keeping in mind also that you need to be very thoughtful about exactly what you're doing in the practice so that the practice does line up very specifically with the skill you're trying to improve. I find that a little bit of work in every lesson is important. Because it will keep reinforcing those skills that you want your student to be able to master. And repetition is certainly going to be a big part of learning proper pronunciation with English, because English pronunciation can be very, very tricky. One of the first questions I always get is, when is it a good idea to correct and when should I not correct? And so I think the first thing to keep in mind is if the pronunciation error drastically affects the ability for your student to communicate. If you can't understand what they're trying to say because the pronunciation error is that strong, that's something that you will need to stop and correct them on. But there are going to be other times where I'm going to say don't stop them. But in a situation where it drastically affects that communication, then you're definitely going to want to jump in there. More precisely, whenever they are speaking and they say something that creates a different word, this happens very, very frequently where you are trying to say one word, a different word comes out. And that's very common because we have a lot of words that are very similar. But you need to be especially careful whenever the new word they have created creates a situation that could be embarrassing for the student. Sometimes a slight mispronunciation can take a rather ordinary everyday thought and turn it into something that sounds quite bad. I think one of my best examples of this is when I was teaching a student and we were talking about what do you like to do on vacation? And the student said, I just want to go someplace hot and lie on a bench. And I'm like, okay, let's look at that word. We need to fix that vowel. E, the E in beach, we need to pull the corners of our mouth way back and go beach. I is pronounced way at the front of your mouth. That's not the vowel we're looking for. Let's pull way back. E, beach. And by jumping in and making that correction, and then everybody working on that correction together so that we get a strong pronunciation on the word beach, it can save that student from being in an embarrassing situation outside of class. And that's one of the advantages that we have. Your student can make those errors with you and it'll be okay because you're in a safe environment where you're going to correct those things and not judge them based on a mispronunciation. And that's something that could happen when they're out in the big wide world. So it's our job to be able to jump in and fix those. And so it's better for them to be able to make that mistake with me than it is out when they're at work or such. So jumping in and fixing in a situation like that is probably the best way to handle it. Also, whenever you're teaching new vocabulary, it is extremely important that you get that pronunciation right from the very beginning. It is so difficult to unteach pronunciation. I used to teach in Slovakia, and Slovak is a phonetic language. Every single letter in a word is pronounced every single time. And I spent over 3 years trying to get the W out of answer because they see the W in answer and they just want to use it. And they learned it that way because that's how it reads. And so it was very confusing for them. So by having it correct when it goes into their brain, you don't have to undo correction. You don't have to undo pronunciation. And undoing pronunciation is very, very difficult. Also, if the focus of the lesson, if you were giving a full lesson on pronunciation, obviously that's going to be a day where you spend tons and tons of time correcting as much as you can. But then it kind of bounces the other direction. When do you not correct? If your student is on a roll, if they're talking and they've got a nice flow of conversation going on, don't interrupt. What I recommend is just taking notes while they're speaking and writing down the words that you're hearing that could use some help with their pronunciation. Write it down. After you get to kind of a stopping point in the conversation, that's when you can go back and look at some of those words that need some help. But if your student is, one of the things that we always want our students to do is to talk more. And so if they're on a roll, don't interrupt, let them keep going with it. So let that flow continue and then correct when you get to a clear stopping point later. If the explanation of the error is just way above what their current level is, and sometimes it's just better to kind of let it slide a little bit and kind of try to get them to say it correctly, but don't spend too much time focusing on it. Also, if that error is just ingrained, if it is, I work with a lot of Spanish speakers now, and I have many, many students who they have come to a school today, and you get that schwa at the beginning of school because they're pulling it out of Spanish where escuela has turned into a school, and we have worked on that many times, and the correction is just, they know it's there, and they just don't want to, they just don't hear it, or it's just so ingrained in how they speak that bringing it up again is just going to create a level of frustration for your student. We don't want our students to get to that point where they're frustrated. We want to make sure that they stay positive about it. And sometimes this is one of those times where it's that pick your battle situation. If it's too ingrained, sometimes it's best to just let it go, particularly if it's not a word that is going to prevent somebody from understanding what they're saying. If it's just that minor little schwa at the beginning of school, sometimes it's best to just let it go. And then also, if correcting your student would harm their confidence, you don't want to make too many corrections if they're speaking in front of their children or their family, or in front of peers. Sometimes it's going to, it could affect, whether they're going to try again in the future. I was talking to a student one time, and her teenage son was there, and she made a couple of fairly substantial errors. And her son was like, Mom, your English is just so bad. I can't even listen to it. And I'm like, great, kid. You have just undone 6 months worth of work getting her confidence up. Really appreciate your help there. Thanks. And so you don't want to be responsible for doing that to your student. And so really be thinking about, as you're making any corrections, if it's going to affect their confidence, hold back and do that in kind of a one-on-one situation if possible. This is probably the most difficult part for some people in dealing with pronunciation. What exactly am I looking for? What do I do to correct someone's pronunciation? The things you're going to have to keep in mind, you're going to be looking at mouth position. You're going to be looking at vowel pronunciation and placement. You're going to be looking at consonant pronunciation and placement. You're going to be looking at stress patterns, and that's going to kind of build the way we are using our language and what's going on with our voice and how do we produce the words. And that is going to be what we're going to spend some time looking at right now. The first thing to be thinking about is mouth placement. And where are sounds vibrating inside your mouth? Not every language produces all their sounds in the same place in the mouth. In American English, if you reached out right now and touched your cheeks and one finger on each cheek, where your fingers would meet in the very center of your mouth is where most sound in English is produced and vibrates. The major vibration is happening right in the middle of your mouth. And that is going to differ from other languages and even other forms of English. Irish pronunciation, for example, Irish pronunciation of English happens way at the front of your mouth. Languages like German can happen where the vibration happens way at the back of your throat. So there's a lot of variation of where that vibration happens. In American English, it tends to be right in the center of your mouth. Then you also have to be thinking about how much vibration is happening within each of the sounds. What are your lips doing? What is your tongue doing? What is your teeth doing? All of that is going to affect how a sound is created. I want to start by looking at vowels. So what is a vowel? You're like, oh, a vowel. That's easy. It's A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y. Great. But what actually is a vowel? What does it mean as far as the creation of the sound is concerned? What we're looking at is a sound that comes from our lungs, pulls the air up from our lungs and out through our mouth with little to no constriction of the airflow. If you're thinking about how those sounds are created, there's almost no change in in the flow of the air as it's coming out of your lungs on a vowel. Things like your tongue and your teeth and your lips may be changing in different shapes, but they're not actually blocking the airflow. Your tongue can be higher in your mouth or lower in your mouth. It can be more front, it can be more back. Think about where your tongue is when you say I or I. You feel like your tongue is pulling up a little higher in your mouth. But when you go to the doctor and he says, open up and say ah, why does he say ah? What ah does is it pulls your tongue to the bottom of your mouth and opens up your mouth extremely wide. In the ah, you're going to feel how your tongue flattens out at the bottom of your mouth. And then you're also going to be thinking about what's going on with your lips. Compare the O and the E. Think about what's going on with your lips when you say boat and how it's very, very round versus beat, which pulls the corners of your mouth way back. So you got boat up front and beat way in the back. And you've got a round versus a flat shape in with your lips. So what's going on with your lips really does affect how that sound is going to come out. I do want to provide a few caveats for the next few slides. And the language purists of the group are likely to have a heart attack on this slide. Sorry about that. But it is something that you need to keep in mind. And I get this question all the time. Regional dialects are going to influence your pronunciation, okay? And that's okay. Let it happen. The letter combination, S-U-R-E, has at least 3 standard pronunciations in American English. You have sure, and sure. All 3 of those are acceptable pronunciations for those 4 letters. There are other letter combinations that have even more correct pronunciations within standard English. So what you need to be thinking about is, what is your student going to hear? What are they going to hear in the part of the country you live in? And teach it like that. And if you are a Southerner with a deep Southern accent and you're working in Boston, do your best to be able to create those New England accents, but don't panic if you don't pronounce all your words in the exact proper way, because the reality is most people around us don't also. So don't stress it. Teach it the way their student is going to hear it, and that's what's going to serve them best. What I've included here is a symbol map for the way sounds are produced. I use these symbols pretty heavily throughout the rest of this, and you'll also see it in the handouts that you're going to get emailed to you. I'm obviously not going to go through this entire chart, but I want you to have it so that when you see these symbols later on, you'll know what I'm talking about. I tend to use the International Phonetic Alphabet symbols as opposed to the American Heritage Dictionary symbols, with one exception in the consonants, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to look at this slide because what we're going to be looking at here is where the vowels are placed in your mouth, and then what you can do to help your student put those vowels where they need to be to get the pronunciation right. A lot of times lip placement is going to be one of the biggest influences on how you get to the sound. And thinking about what's happening with those, particularly those sounds that are happening more at the front of your mouth, and like heat, which has a very closed mouth, hit, hate, and head, you can start feeling your mouth opening up. And then when you get all the way down to hat, your mouth opens up a great deal. And so by having those understanding of where that vowel is changing your lip placement is going to help you correct those sounds. And one of the things I recommend is before you start teaching a lot of pronunciation, grab a mirror or stand at home in front of your bathroom mirror and go through all of the vocabulary you want to teach and look at what's going on with your face. Where is that sound happening? And then once you can see how it's happening on your face, you can also then help your student correct and make that sound properly with their own voice. And so being able to understand where what your lips are doing and where the vibration is happening should help you with those vowels. One of the tricky things about English is our use of diphthongs, where we have this sliding between two sounds. And I think probably the easiest ones to hear it are in like brown, where we're going from an ow, where we got two very clear sounds sliding between one another. Toy, meal, all of those, you hear that very distinct slide. Sometimes these can get really fuzzy whenever you're looking at pronunciation from one part of the country to another, because those regional accents are going to shift how much of the diphthong is there. Sometimes they're going to tighten down into almost one sound. Sometimes they're going to be really stretched out. And so the amount of glide is going to vary from place to place around the United States. One of the things that can make this particularly tricky is there are certain languages that either rarely or never have diphthongs. Japanese, for example, almost never has a diphthong. You may see 3 vowels in a row, but each gets its own syllable. Also, the Bantu languages of Central Africa, like Swahili, almost never has diphthongs in it. They have very strict pronunciation of all of their vowels, and they're very tight, and they never glide. We also have to deal with R-colored vowels, where you have that R after the vowel, which is going to influence how it's produced or how it sounds. So we go from he to her, adding that R into cart, ear, buyer, how that the R is going to affect the pronunciation of the vowel. I realize that those of you from Boston have no idea what I'm talking about because you don't use the R-colored vowels with any of your pronunciation. But trust me, it's there for the rest of us. Jumping into consonants. So what is a consonant? Well, it's easy. Everything that's not a vowel, right? Yes, but what does that actually mean? A consonant is a sound that's produced by stopping the diverting or by hindering the flow of air from your lungs. So if you look at things like p, b, you actually have that tight stop that is affecting the air coming through. With letters like M, sounds like M, N, and Ng, all of that is diverting up into your sinus and kind of out through your nose, or hindering, where you've got th or v, where a lot of air is still coming through, but you're tightening down with your lips and kind of slowing that process of what the air is doing, and then adding some extra vibration up there at the front of your mouth. So as vowels let the air flow freely, consonants will either stop it, divert it, or slow it down. This is the chart of how all of our consonants are produced. These symbols are going to be much more straightforward. I tend to use the phonetic symbol, except I do tend to use the letter J instead of Y for the J sound, or for for the Y sound. In like you and mayor, I tend to use the letter Y, and so I don't necessarily follow the phonetic symbol on that one. But most of the other times in all of the handouts you're going to be receiving, you're going to see the phonetic symbol. We do have a lot of digraphs where we have two letters that are combined to make a single sound. In other languages, they may make these changes with diacritic marks. They'll add a caron or an accent or something, but we tend to do it with digraphs to get the ch, sh, the, wa, fa, na. And so we do often use double letters, do a combination of letters to get to those sounds. But digraphs are different from blends, where we have two sounds that kind of pull together to create a more unified sound. In general, we tend to have double letter and triple letter blends. We don't often go beyond that. Pla, sma, spla, spra. Where you don't hear a vowel in the middle there, it's definitely that combination of the consonants blended together. Again, you're going to, depending on the language families you work with, you're going to have some speakers who really struggle with these. Particularly the Southeast Asian languages and the Polynesian languages do not like to use consonant blends. Then there's other languages that just seem to love them. The Slavic languages in particular, you see tons of consonant blends. One of my favorite Slovak words is stvrt, spelled STVRT. STVRT, so 5 letters, no vowel. It means quarter, and so you just don't get a vowel in that word at all. The longest consonant cluster in English, for those of you who are kind of trivia minded, is angst. So the plural of angst is ANGSTS, so we got a 5 consonant cluster there at the end of that word. Which is the only word in the English language that does that. So next time you're playing trivia, you got one more answer. If I were to be asked, what is the one quickest thing that I can do to improve someone's pronunciation? And if you ask a trained actor or a trained singer, what's that one thing that they can do? And a lot of them are going to tell you the same thing. Focus on a final consonant sound. That final consonant sound will clean up so much of your pronunciation problems, and what they can do to fix that, to be able to be understood. This is another one that can also be kind of tricky because there are a lot of languages, particularly tonal languages, that never end a word in a consonant. And so and they always use a consonant vowel, consonant vowel, consonant vowel in every syllable. And so putting a consonant at the end of the word is almost unheard of. The only times, particularly in languages like Burmese, the only time you'll ever really hear that is when they have a m, a n, or an ing at the end, those diverted sounds, which will pull up through their nasal cavity. So sometimes you'll hear those at the end of a word, but that's pretty much it. You just have words ending in vowels most of the time. So that is something that can be very, very tricky for a lot of your learners, because they're not used to ending a word in a consonant. And so sometimes they will try to put they'll try to put a schwa at the end of it. And sometimes some of those languages also will not allow for consonant blends. And so they may try to shove a schwa in between each of those consonants in the blend as well. And so you get a word like strawberry, which would come out as strawberry, where they're trying to get a vowel into those spaces, and sometimes it can make things a little difficult for your student to pronounce those words correctly. But once you can get them to really focusing on what that final sound is going to be, that's going to really help them a lot. And I think one of the best examples of this is the difference between can and can't. That T really does make a huge difference on the end of that word, and really helping your student focus on the end of that consonant. That last final consonant is going to definitely help their ability to be understood. English stress patterns can cause stress. I completely get it. That's one of the problems that we have, particularly whenever we have rules that are generally true, but not always true. I think one of some of the rules that you really need to be thinking about, most of the time in a 2-syllable word, you'll see that with nouns and adjectives, the stress is on the first syllable. And then on verbs, the stress tends to be on the last syllable. I think the place where this is clearest is whenever you have a word that is both a noun and a verb, like progress and progress. You can clearly hear that the stress shifts from the first syllable in progress in the noun to progress to the second syllable in the verb. Same with record, the noun, and record, the verb. So where that stress hits is going to often tell you if it's a noun or a verb. In longer words, it's a little bit trickier. Sometimes we put it on the second to last syllable, particularly if the word ends in ic, like geographic is going to put that syllable stress on the second to last syllable. If the word ends in shun, extension, retribution, we slide into that second to last. If there are times where it's going to be third to last, particularly if the word ends in CYTY, PHY, GY, democracy, we've pulled in to that third syllable. And then words that end in all, like critical, again, exceptional, it pulls into that third to last syllable. And then whenever we have words that end in ER or LY, it tends to move all the way to the first syllable, happily, manager. So those suffixes are going to have a big influence on where the stress hits and pushing it further and further back into the word. In compound words, it tends to follow the same rule as the noun or verb or adjective part of speech. Like football puts it on the first of the word, keyboard, again, we're on the first of the word. So it tends to follow that same stress pattern. In like air conditioned, got that the second word, understand, again, we're pulling it to the end, into that second syllable. We also see this in those adjectives where we have, it follows the stress pattern of the second word in the compound word. So old fashioned, it uses that first syllable from fashioned. In bad tempered, again, we're looking at that first syllable from the second word. my general advice when working with pronunciation, the first thing that we need to look at, I have some tools for you to use to practice. I have some handouts that we're going to email out to you that are going to have a lot of these that you can work with your student on. I think minimal pairs are fantastic for helping you practice. If you're not familiar with minimal pairs, it is a word where there is just one small change in the between the two words. So you have bat and bet. You have that change in the vowel in the middle. Sit and seat. Mayor and major. So you have that that one change right in the middle that will help your student practice and focus on that one specific sound that you're trying to work on. I like using odd one out. Which of these things is different? Heat, seat, hit. Plays, place, space. Have your student listening for which one is different, which is the odd one out. Most of our students have a recording device in their pockets. You can get apps to help you record your sound on your phone, and then you can listen back and help your student listen. And are they hearing the same thing from themselves as they are hearing from you? And how do the sounds vary, and what can be done to fix those? And then one of the lovely things that will be helpful when working and helping your student practice are tongue twisters. There are I'm gonna give you a link in the follow-up with a page that has lots and lots of tongue twisters at different levels, working on different sounds. So one of my favorite ones of these, when I was working in Slovakia, they do not have a TH sound, and so they struggle with pronouncing the. And so I would have my students work on the tongue twister. Whether the weather is cold or whether the weather is hot, we'll be together, whatever the weather, whether we like it or not. Got a lot of THs in there, and a lot of them are internal THs, which makes it a little bit trickier for them. So those are great to help your student work on their pronunciation. There's also a textbook series called Clear Speech by Judy Gilbert, which is a really excellent textbook that you can use. It is from Cambridge University Press, but you can find it on Amazon. And I really like that book to help you and your student work on their pronunciation. So some general tips. Slow down. And by slow down, I mean both you and your student. Both of you need to work on making sure that you are each pronouncing the word correctly so that your student's hearing it and then repeating it. A lot of times speaking too quickly is going to affect your ability to be understood. And so slow down, both of you. You and your student both need to be listening carefully. They need to be listening to how you're pronouncing the sound. You need to be listening to how they are pronouncing the sound. You can't fix their sound if you don't know exactly what it is they're doing wrong. So you may recognize this is incorrect pronunciation, but if you don't really focus on what it is that they did, then you won't be able to help correct it properly. You need your student to be able to repeat what they hear, and you need to be able to repeat what you hear. And so using that will help both of you. Okay? And then practice, 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 practice. I probably can't stress that enough. Practice, that's how we get better at things. We practice. Okay, I have been watching the little number counter on the Q&A continue to grow. So we're now at a spot where I can answer some of these questions. Go ahead, Todd.
No, I was going to say, all right, you're absolutely right. We've got a lot of questions. A lot of them are really good questions. A lot of them are technical questions. So we'll just start kind of going down the line, and I'll ask them, and Danielle will kind of keep track of what we've done. Again, let me remind you that For those of you who need to leave at the top of the hour, that is perfectly fine. But Stephen has agreed to stick around and make sure everybody's questions get answered. So that will be on the recording. Even if you have to leave before your particular question gets answered, it'll be on the recording that we send out. And everybody is welcome to kind of stick around afterwards and listen to all of those responses. But we will ask you to get your questions in before the top of the hour. All right. Our first question is from Jeremy. And he just asked, when you talk about perfect pronunciation, what does that mean?
Perfect is really difficult because obviously, most Americans don't have perfect pronunciation, so we absolutely cannot expect our students to. What I would suggest here is they are able to be clearly understood in most situations. Not like I feel like for us, we work with English language learners all the time, so our ears are trained and we can hear what the student is trying to say. But what you need to be thinking about is, would the average person be able to understand? And if so, that's kind of what we're aiming for. Perfect is probably not what we're aiming for.
Fantastic. I think that's a good guideline. And just to let people know, I think Danielle is also posting links to the coaching sessions in the chat. So if you're interested in signing up for a coaching session and want to take advantage of those links in the chat, you can do that now. But also, you'll be getting emails and such like that with registration links as well. All right, our next question is from Linda. And she asked, are you addressing pronunciation as students read aloud or in English language learning in general? So does this happen as students are reading aloud? Does it happen when you're doing, kind of practice and conversations or oral vocabulary? When are you doing this?
Again, what we're looking at, for me, I feel it's much more about whenever your student's on a roll, particularly like when they're reading a passage, I would not interrupt them while they are doing it, but at the end of their paragraph, if they're supposed to read one paragraph, I would then pull the words that were the ones that really stood out as needing corrections and look at some of those. But you just have to be kind of judicious about when you stop and correct and when you don't. And if they're on a roll, if they're reading something and they're moving through it fairly easily, let it go, and then at the end, kind of insert those corrections. I wouldn't necessarily stop them unless that pronunciation is so bad that others in the room are having trouble understanding what's being said.
Okay, and I'm going to ask a follow-up to that, Stephen. When you're kind of looking at your lesson plan, do you have a particular kind of segment of your lesson where you work on just pronunciation? So do you kind of say, or are you just kind of working on pronunciation as people are doing other oral activities? Is there a part of your lesson where you say, okay, now we're going to practice this particular sound, and we do drills and things like that?
Sometimes I will create a lesson that is just built around pronunciation, and so we'll spend some time working on particularly difficult sound combinations. And so I will put in sections sometimes that are designed specifically for pronunciation. Most of the time, it's just kind of in the flow of everything else that's happening. But anytime I do new pronunciation, new vocabulary, anytime there's new vocabulary, there will be a focus on the pronunciation of those words. I tend to pre-teach vocabulary at the beginning of lessons. And so we'll spend some time learning the new vocabulary and making sure our pronunciation is correct on that before we start sliding into the rest of the lesson. But then there will be certain times where I'll create a 20-30 minute section of my class, and we'll just focus on the pronunciation for that.
Okay, perfect. And you talked a little bit about this. This is a question from Mitch. You talked a little bit about this, the importance of this in your presentation. Mitch asks, any suggestions for helping people who don't pronounce the S at the end of the word? For example, United States instead of states. And you talked about like the importance of really focusing on that ending consonant to improve pronunciation. So how do you address that?
You know, practice. But yes, that is something that we do see from certain language families where they like to drop that final S. And so that is something that you need to be very conscious on. And that's a time where I would work with some minimal pairs, and I would build it around singulars and plurals. And so state, states, state, states, and really hitting that S sound at the end of it. And that TS sound can be a bit tricky for some people. And there is a lovely little tongue twister. He thrusts his fists against the posts and still insists he sees the ghosts, that really focus on that ST, TS, STS. And so working with something like that would help you get the extra practice in for those who are dropping that final S.
All right, great. I hadn't even thought about tongue twisters, but I guess that's what they're designed to do.
It's exactly what they're designed to do.
And Mitch asked if we could write that down, that tongue twister down in the chat. So we may come back to you and get you to do that,
Okay.
so that it's in the transcript.
Will do.
Question from Jeremy. Often when we talk about correcting pronunciation, we approach it from a Eurocentric U.S. standard perspective. How do you combat this in your practice?
Well, one of the things that I want to keep in mind is, what is my student going to be able to hear? What are they hearing in their community? And so because of that, we do tend to approach it from a local point of view. And so we want to get their pronunciation such that they can be understood in their community. Now, I realize that there are going to be, I never tell my students that our goal is to get you to where you have an American accent, so you sound like an American. Unless somebody has an extremely good ear, that's not going to happen. If there's somebody who is extremely good with language and accents, you see actors who can switch among accents fairly easily. But the average person can't do that. And the average person doesn't need to do that. You don't need to completely remove their Chinese accent, their Swahili accent, their German accent, whichever it is. You don't have to remove the accent. You just need to get there to where they can be understood by the average person. And so don't have your students stress on that. Also, you may have the occasional students like, I want you to correct every single mistake you hear of my pronunciation. Do not do that. It's not important for one thing, and it's going to destroy your student self-esteem for another. Because unless there is a very specific reason, because they're about to go on stage as an American and they need an American accent, that would be the only time I would really work with somebody to completely remove an accent. Beyond that, don't worry about it. Don't stress it. Don't stress yourself. Don't stress your students.
Okay, that sounds good. We have a question from Santina. Please, can you give more examples of vibration placement in the mouth?
Okay. Let me turn on my video. So maybe if people could see me, that would make a difference. Are you able to see me? I'm not sure.
Yes.
Okay. So if my fingers were able to touch right in the very center, that's where the average vibration for American vowel sounds happens, right in the very, very center. But you'll find that like in a lot of Germanic languages, also in some of the Arabic and Persian languages, vibration happens much further back here, and you get more of a ha sound that comes through in certain words in those languages that you don't get in American English. Our vibration happens way up here. And so that's one of those things that you need to be thinking about. And then thinking about like what do your lips do to affect that that vibration pronunciation, the way it comes out, like the way heat is pulled way back, heat, and hot, and how your jaw drops down, and the vibration is going to shift within your mouth.
Okay.
I think this is probably one of those things that if you come to a coaching session, I would be able to get into that more, and you'd be able to see me, and I'd be able to see you better. So
Okay. Great suggestion to come to a coaching session and get some more of that. And I actually just put a link for Teaching Adults ESL in the chat. They have a great appendix in the back of that resource book, all the sounds in the English language and really good descriptions about how to form them and different things like that. So you guys might find that to be a helpful resource as well. Another question from Jeremy: how helpful do you find it to incorporate the International Phonetic Alphabet into your pronunciation instruction?
Unless your student has studied this in their own language, I would not find it particularly helpful. I would find it confusing. Particularly if you're working with lower level learners who are barely literate in their first language, or they're learning, they're learning the Latin alphabet for the first time. You're just going to confuse them. Don't do that. Those symbols are there for you, for your use. Don't overburden your student with it.
That makes sense. Question from Janine: is it necessary for me to learn all of the phonetic symbols to teach successfully?
No. You may find that the American Heritage Dictionary symbols are easier for you to work with. If that's the case, use those. Way back in college, I learned the phonetic symbols for a speech class I was taking, and that's why it's more comfortable for me to work with those, and that's why I work with those. Use the ones that are best for you, and you don't have to learn them all, because there's a gazillion of them.
Okay, great. Another question from Jeremy: what do you find is the best way to encourage self-advocacy? And I am assuming that's related to pronunciation, like how do you encourage people to advocate for helping them with pronunciation, maybe?
That's a good question. I just, in general, I feel like it's important for our students to, I always start my class whenever I am just opening a new session of class. I teach them how to ask questions that they need that will lead to that advocacy. Things like, how do you say this word? How do you pronounce this? How do you spell that? All of those things I teach. My first lesson is specifically about how to have my students advocate for themselves, and because that's going to help me teach better. And so if my student is able to say, can you repeat that? And they're comfortable saying it, because a lot of times our students aren't comfortable saying, can you say that again? Can you slow down? Can you speak louder? They may not be comfortable saying it. So I literally have the first half hour or more of my very first lesson is dealing with their advocacy, what they can do to make sure that I am teaching them better.
Perfect. And I think we are at the top of the hour. So let me just kind of take a quick break and say, for those of you who attended and have to get off, thank you all for attending. This has been a great webinar and very well attended. As I said, you'll get a email in about a week with links to the recordings and the other resources that Stephen has talked about, as well as a separate email with links to sign up for the coaching sessions. And Stephen's already talked about some of the things that he might be able to address in those coaching sessions that can't really address here, and how they might be valuable for you. And he's put up the schedule on the slides. If you want to stick around and listen, we've got about 16 questions to go. So we're going to cut things off here. And if you want to stick around and listen to Stephen's responses to the remaining questions, you're welcome to do so. All right, let's get back to it. Another question from Jeremy. How do you approach teaching people who are working with people learning English to be better listeners? So if you're responsible for training your tutors or teachers to work with English language learners, how do you work with them to be better listeners?
So again, it's the same situation where I talk to my volunteers about what they can do to be better listeners, is really kind of focus on what are the sounds that you're hearing and what are the sounds that you're expecting to hear, and then how do those things line up? Are they matching? Are they not matching? And so that's what I try to get what I tell people to do whenever that comes up. I'm like, really, it's about focus, and it's about really kind of being in the moment and really listening to what is being said.
Okay, and I think that's hard for a lot of people because people aren't necessarily accustomed to focused listening, especially focused listening for sounds, as opposed to focused listening for kind of the larger meaning of what somebody is saying or the general kind of gist of what somebody's saying. They're not typically focused on individual pronunciation when they're listening. So it really is a different skill.
Yes, it is.
Okay. How does focusing, this is a question from Linda, how does focusing on final sound relate to reduced forms and en and end dropping?
So I'm assuming what you're meaning here is shifting from going to gonna. And that's one of those things that I kind of take that as a separate entity. And I do spend time talking about how they're going to hear phrases like gonna or shoulda, and how that reducing the form or the mushing the words together or bad pronunciation in English, how it's just a thing that we do need to work on, and it's something we need to be conscious of and hear. But for their speaking, I tend to try to get them to use going to instead of gonna for as long as I can, until they get comfortable enough with the language that it starts creeping in on its own. But in general, I do recommend just kind of stick to the going to.
So you kind of start with the precise pronunciation, and then when they get comfortable with that, you get into the more kind of blended, continuous, fluent, the way people actually speak English.
Right. Let the flow sort of happen organically.
That makes sense. Question from Lewis. What is a schwa?
Schwa is the sound, like in the word the vowel there is a schwa.
And I think all of the vowels can make a schwa sound. Is that correct?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
That's the joy of English. We kind of make up pronunciation any way we want to. We don't care what the letter is, just throw it in there. we'll make it say what we want it to say.
And question from Jeremy, what resources do you use for discussing regional and cultural variants in stress patterns?
I don't have any specific resources that I use for those things. It tends to be one of those that kind of happens kind of case by case as it comes up in our lessons.
And you talked about earlier about just in general approaching pronunciation according to the regional dialect of the area that the students are in. So I would say kind of part of that is really kind of paying attention to the stress patterns or what have you that they might hear in your general area or community and focusing on those. It's not necessary for them to learn stress patterns on the other side of the country.
Right.
Yeah.
Focus on what they're hearing at work.
Yeah. And then question from Lisa asked about the correct stress for air conditioned.
Okay, again, we're looking at potentially a regional situation here, because in certain regions it's going to be air conditioned and some situations going to be air conditioned, so that the stress could be on the first word, it could be on the first syllable of the second word, and that's going to be a regional thing. Do which one matches your locality.
Okay, that sounds good. And I think we hear a theme here about just really matching the area that you're in. How do you help students with the two sounds of TH?
I spent 3 years in Slovakia working on this one because they don't have the sound. The first thing you have to do to create the sound is you have to start with your tongue between your teeth. You cannot make that sound without your tongue between your teeth. And I will sit there with my students and go, this, that, these, those. And we're going to really hit that the very, very hard. And it's going to feel ridiculous because you don't normally stick your tongue out that far when you're making that sound. But then once you have bit down on your tongue just a little bit, extend that vibration and let them feel that vibration. And that's going to give you the difference between bath and bathe, is the amount of vibration that's happening in that TH sound. And so that's the way you get there. Start with your tongue between your teeth and vibrate your tongue. And that's what's going to get you there.
Great.
It feels ridiculous. Go with it.
And that kind of brings up, I think, another issue kind of related to the pronunciation issue is when students are decoding new English words for the first time and there's a consonant or a vowel or a letter combination that has multiple sounds, and students trying to kind of figure out which sound to use. That's not necessarily a pronunciation problem. That's a decoding problem. Right. And we want to kind of make sure we understand that it's not a pronunciation problem. It's kind of a coding and guessing problem. And if they haven't heard that word before, they may pick the wrong sound because they don't have a context to help them choose.
And particularly if that sound doesn't exist in their language.
In their language, yes.
And so you'll hear a lot of Slavic speakers will use fa or something, or ta or da in replacement of the, because it's just a sound that they're not used to hearing. Okay, perfect. And I'm going to stop with the Q&A for a minute. And Danielle has a couple of questions that people posted into the chat, so we don't want to lose those. And I'll give her a chance to ask those, and then we'll come back to the chat folks.
Okay, great. I have two questions. The first one is from Mitch. He touched upon, you have alluded to cultural and linguistic differences influencing pronunciation. However, the ethnicity of students may involve physiological geometric differences of the articulator mechanisms. Do you have any prescribed physical exercises to address this?
I don't really off the top of my head have anything that's like that like I have like copies of that you could use. What I tend to do in those situations, I figure out what the sound is that's problematic, and I tend to deal with I would jump into minimal pairs that are affected by the problematic sound, and figure out what sound it is that's creating the difficulty. And I think probably one of the most common one of these there's a couple of them, in Polish in particular, the v and w sound tends to be somewhere between the two sounds, and they don't necessarily hear a difference. You also have a similar situation with b and v in Spanish, and with la and ra in some of the Asian languages. And so in those cases, what I do is I really look at mouth placement on how those two sounds are created. If we're looking at w versus v, how the lip rolls in on v versus w, which is all out in front of our mouth. Same with b versus v for Spanish. You got that lip rolling in for the v, but you don't for the b. La and ra is all about tongue placement. For la to happen, you have to start with your tongue at the top of your mouth, and with ra, it's flat on the bottom of your mouth. So you have la versus ra, and what's happening with the tongue, the la at the start and the va at the bottom. So I tend to do that through a minimal pair thing, but practicing on what's going on very specifically with the mouth.
Great, thank you, Stephen. The last question I have is from Barbara. How do you teach stress patterns when the learner cannot read in English?
That's just always one of our challenges, isn't it? In that case, what we're doing, we're going to be really, it's probably going to feel a lot more like rote practice, just listening to where the stress is. And I would probably do some sort of clapping exercise or tapping exercise, looking at where those syllables are and which one gets hit hardest as I'm tapping on the table.
I know there's an activity in that Teaching Adults book that I linked to earlier about using rubber bands, kind of a similar thing of stretching them out different lengths for the emphasis. But I've heard of several of those types of activities where you're kind of turning the stress pattern into a physical activity that the student is doing.
Yeah, I would think something like that would probably be how I would address that.
Okay. I'm going to skip Jeremy for just a second because I think this is a really good question that comes in from somebody anonymously. I work with a conversation group. Should I avoid correcting one person if others don't make the same error? Seems obvious not to correct, but unsure of what to do. It's a great question.
Yes, I like that question. So what I tend to do in classes that have a lot of people with a lot of different backgrounds as far as their first language and their pronunciation. Again, I really kind of think about, is this a problem that is affecting the student's ability to be understood by the group? If it is, then I might address it a little bit during the lesson. For the most part, I would probably look at that with the student maybe after class or at the end of class. Say, hey, I want to look at these sounds with you. And then kind of pull that that student aside and kind of help that student individually. I wouldn't want to eat up a lot of time in class because only one student is needing that. I also wouldn't want to single that student out for something that could be considered embarrassing. And I wouldn't want to like really harp on one student's pronunciation while not working with everyone. If it is fairly substantial, I would make it a lesson for everybody in the class, even if it's not something that everybody is focusing on, but everybody is practicing these words.
Okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. Back to Jeremy's question, what are some methods you use to address the perception that sounding like English is the first language is the goal? So when students say, I want to sound like a native English speaker, and that's kind of an unrealistic goal, how do you address that?
I am very honest about that, particularly whenever I have like a higher level student who's like, I want to sound just like an American. My question is always, why? What is it that you're going to gain out of putting that much stress and focus on yourself on creating that? If you are auditioning for some movies where you need a strong American accent, yeah, okay, I'm with you. Let's work on some of those things. Other than that, don't worry about it. Don't stress yourself out. We have so many other problems in our English language that you are going to have to get around, like our lovely spelling. So let's focus on those problems and not panic on trying to make yourself sound like an American. It's not something that most people are able to really accomplish, and even people who have lived in the country and speak English every day and have for the last 40 years, there's still an accent there, and it's not that big a deal. Don't worry about it.
And actually, Doris posted in the chat what I think is a kind of a great thing to remember. She says that she asked them if they've ever heard of Zsa Zsa Gabor, who spoke perfectly with a marvelous accent.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Doris.
Heidi Klum.
Yes.
Just perfect English, still has an accent. So what?
Question from Lindsay. Many of our students have learned British English. Should we reteach in American English?
No.
No. I think the only thing would be around vocabulary, right? As opposed to pronunciation.
Right. If they are saying a different word than we are saying, then I would probably say, hey, this is how we say it. And I realize you've learned British English, but this is how in American English we say it. So it's not something that I would not try to completely change their British pronunciations of things. It's not that big a deal.
Yeah. Any tips on how to help encourage learners that might be more on the shy side?
Okay, so use this trick, and I do this all the time, particularly whenever I've got somebody who's really shy, who speaks very, very softly. I say that I have hearing loss in one ear, and that I struggle to hear them, and that I really need them to speak louder because I don't hear very well, and it's all my fault. And by taking the blame off of them and putting it on my bad ears, they will tend to speak louder and often will punch through with a little more confidence because it's not their fault that I'm not hearing them, it's mine.
That's excellent. That's excellent.
I use that all the time. I do have a tad bit of hearing loss, not nearly as much as I claim to when I'm working with
we use all the tools at our disposal, right?
Absolutely, unashamedly.
Question from Joanne, which I think is also a really good one these days. Any hints to help when wearing a mask in class while teaching?
Suffer. No, I think the thing that you need to be focusing on is kind of over pronouncing your words, pushing a little further than you normally would. Also making sure you're speaking loud enough because it's very easy to kind of swallow your sounds in a mask. Really focus on how and almost over exaggerate a lot of what you're saying so that it comes through a little bit clearer, because that mask is hindering your pronunciation. Yeah, that's a tough one, and I'm thinking it's probably going to be here to stay for a while.
Yeah, and Stephen, I know, so that's in terms of hearing, but you've also talked during the webinar about the value of being able to see the student's mouth and what they're doing, and them being able to see your mouth. And obviously that's an issue when people are wearing a mask. And I know for some programs, when they first opened up during the pandemic, that they made use of kind of plexiglass dividers in between the student and tutor. So maybe something like that. If the issue is less about hearing and more about demonstration and seeing the mouth,
Yeah.
is maybe taking advantage of some of those things where the student can feel safe, or you can feel safe behind the plexiglass, but they can still see your mouth.
Right. Yeah, something like that can help.
Okay. And also regarding mouth stuff, there's also, I think, good videos online that you can find, like on YouTube, where people are demonstrating how the mouth functions and looks. And then it looks like Lauren has just posted a link to clear masks that will help with that as well. So hopefully we've given you some good suggestions. Next question from Joyce. Do you share the charts that you used in your presentation? How do you use them in a lesson?
I don't share those with my students. They would get confusing.
Okay, so those are more for you and like when
Yes.
you're training other tutors and teachers.
Yes.
Perfect. Question from Danette. What about words with grouping of vowels in words, such as good and would versus food? This goes back to the choosing the correct sound that we were talking about.
So I tend to start by apologizing for our language and how we kind of make up our pronunciation as we go along. And just explain that there are times where you have the same letter combination that is going to create different sounds. And sometimes they are going to have a pattern, and sometimes they won't. If you look at that letter combination, O-U-G-H, it has about 8 common sounds in the English language. And unfortunately, just rote memorization is how we get to knowing which one is which.
Yeah,
Sorry.
there's some kind of similar to a tongue twister. There's a sentence I know that uses all 8 of those O-U-G-H sounds in one sentence. Question from Jean. Can you recommend a resource that identifies by specific language which English sounds would be the most problematic to learners?
Well, depending on which language families you're talking about, the handouts that I will be emailing you have that broken down into about, I think it's 6 or 7 different languages or language families. And so hopefully that will help you out, because I know I have it in Spanish, I have Southeast Asian languages, Southern Asian languages, some of the Bantu languages. And so a lot of those are broken down by specific language and what some of their common issues are within the language.
Okay, great. We'll look forward to those handouts. A couple of more questions. One from Dom, which I don't think is actually a question. Dom just asked, how would I go about sharing a small chart that I use to teach long and short vowel sounds? And I'm just going to say, Dom, if you want to email that to Danielle, you can put your email address in the chat, and Danielle will be happy to kind of share that with the group if you do that right away, and as part of the resources that we send out. How does that work?
Sounds good.
Perfect. All right. And last question from Anna. Any tips for working with people at different pronunciation levels? So if you have a class, this is kind of similar to that question about correcting one person in the group.
Yeah. So what I would do is, like I said earlier, it's going to depend on if that problem is unique to that one student, then I would really kind of maybe pull that student aside and work with them individually, or if I've got like a clump of students who these have this problem and these have this problem, may want to divide up into groups, into small groups, and work individually with each of the groups.
Great, great. And Stephen, kind of related to that, I mean, we think about instruction a lot of times in a multi-level class, and people have like different levels of language expertise, but is pronunciation really leveled like that, or is it more about just kind of use and practice more than anything else?
It's different than, like, say, judging somebody's reading level or writing level. But yes, there are certain people who have like a really strong grasp of their listening comprehension skills, but their pronunciation they struggle a lot on. And so I guess you could divide a group by their pronunciation level. It would be a little trickier, but I definitely think you could do it.
Okay, good. And that's all of our questions. So let me again thank everybody for attending the webinar. Again, you're going to get a follow-up emails in about a week. Encourage folks once again to attend those coaching sessions. Go ahead and sign up for those. And clearly this was a topic that a lot of people were needed and were interested in. So some great questions. Thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Stephen, for the great information you shared with us today. And everybody go and have a great rest of the day.
I'm really looking forward to these coaching sessions.
I am too. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.